For those of you just joining, I'm just going to give it one more minute and then we'll get started. I see the number going up for people joining. Okay, get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our third annual Research Ethics Lecture here at Massachusetts General Hospital, co-sponsored by the MGH Division of Clinical Research and the Harvard Center for Bioethics at Harvard Medical School. I'm Melissa Abraham, Director of the Research Ethics Consultation Service in the Division of Clinical Research and faculty in the Department of Psychiatry and at the Center for Bioethics. And my co-moderator today is Rebecca Lee, faculty at the Center for Bioethics and CEO of Vivly, a nonprofit for data sharing. The Research Ethics Lecture Series was designed to provide the opportunity for interdisciplinary discussion of ethical issues pertinent to our clinical research and bioethics communities, issues which have practical applications in the work of clinical research, such as the development of new medicines and treatments. We're delighted that all of you have joined us to hear from Carla Childers today on the topic ethical considerations of access to investigational medicines. After Ms. Childers' presentation, Dr. Lee will moderate a Q&A session. We encourage you to submit questions to the hosts using the Q&A feature. Carla Childers is the head of bioethics-based science and technology policy in the Office of the Chief Medical Officer at Johnson & Johnson. Ms. Childers joined Johnson & Johnson in October 2013, where her primary responsibility has been leading and coordinating various ethics-based science and technology policy projects. Ms. Childers is the chair of the J&J Bioethics Committee, which serves as an internal forum providing advice on bioethical questions within J&J. She serves as a bioethics subject matter expert for various internal and external science and technology policy work and coordinates J&J's internal bioethics educational program. She has also been actively engaged outside J&J in various R&D and ethics-based work. She has volunteered at the Drug Information Association for the past decade, most recently co-founding their bioethics community. She also serves on the board of the nonprofit Fellowships at Auschwitz for the Study of Professional Ethics, an organization that challenges graduate students and future leaders to recognize and confront their ethical responsibilities as professionals by analyzing the decisions and actions of Nazi-era professionals. Ms. Childers also shares her passion for bioethics with others through teaching. She is a lecturer in the Columbia University Master of Bioethics program and serves as an adjunct faculty member in the Temple University School of Pharmacy's Regulatory Affairs and Quality Assurance graduate program. Before joining J&J, she was an associate director in global project management at Merck, where she managed cross-functional drug development teams in various therapeutic areas and stages of development. Ms. Childers began her career in industry as an organic chemist in Merck's process chemistry group. Welcome, Carla, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I really appreciate it. Thank you to both you and Rebecca for the invitation. And hopefully you all are still awake. I'm sorry that was so long, but at least it gives you a little bit of a context of the work I've done. So I'm going to go ahead and start screen share. And as Melissa mentioned, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. And let me just, one more technology bit. Great. So Melissa already commented on my background, so I will give the next slide just as a point of fact for disclosures, it's probably obvious that I'm an employee and shareholder of Johnson & Johnson, as Melissa mentioned, and I lecture at Columbia. And I'm very proud member of the board of directors of FASB. And while I'm showing up here today in my actual J&J office, what I'm going to express, the opinions are mine. I'm happy to have a conversation and debate about it, but I just like to include this up front for appropriate disclosures. So I happened to scan through the list of participants, and I can see that we've actually got quite a few wonderful experts in their own rights on the topics that we're going to talk about today. So to give you a sense of what I'm going to cover, I want to dive into continued access to investigational medicines, which people may not always think about or don't talk about as much as pre-approval access. And then I want to talk about what we would call compassionate use or pre-approval access. And I'm going to do that in the sense of trying to provide some practical experience and considerations from my perspective, from my professional career, thinking about things like terminology, intent behind why we do these programs, diving in a bit to the stakeholder perspective. The ethical considerations, especially in pre-approval access, I think have been well discussed in the literature, but I'll hit some highlights of the things that we think about, and then really spend a little bit of time on the challenges in each of these spaces before we do the Q&A. And I asked Melissa about the general makeup of the audience, and it sounds like there is some familiarity with the drug development process, so I won't bore you all to tears with a deep overview, but I did think it would be useful to talk at least and kind of remind folks that, and this is perhaps reminding you of the obvious, but that what we're talking about when we talk about these access to investigational medicines, we're talking about here in the part when we're still conducting clinical trials prior to FDA or other health authority review and approval. And I think this is important because it just level sets that we're following a legal process and framework. There is an approach in place to approve drugs for a purpose, to ensure that they're safe and effective, to make sure that we don't repeat a lot of the mistakes over the decades of unsafe products coming to market and harming people. So there is a backbone and a framework and a very appropriate set of controls. And yet, we acknowledge that this process can take a long time. We acknowledge that it can be complex, and also that not everyone can participate in clinical trials or have access. So that's why I'm really excited to talk about these two particular topics. One, because I don't think continued access perhaps gets enough understanding by people. It's not as common to talk about, but just to kind of place in context some of the considerations. And as I mentioned, I will be approaching this from more of an industry perspective, giving some insights in that regard, as well as from a bioethics perspective. And I'm trying to use a similar model for two to draw some contrasts. The first topic I want to cover is the continued access to investigational medicines. And as the name implies, what we're talking about is something someone already has access to. And I'm a big stickler for terminology. Words matter. What you call things matter. So I thought I'd start out just by unpacking some of the terms that people often use when they're talking about this. So post-trial responsibilities is a much broader term used to encompass more than just access to an intervention. Think about post-trial responsibilities to seek regulatory approval. How do we think about safety follow-up and reporting? What about dissemination of results and publications? So there's an umbrella of different types of responsibilities that research sponsors have and manufacturers have. Specifically, continued access to an investigational medicine is a more specific term, and it's a bit of a mouthful, but it's more descriptive and I think more accurate. This is talking about continuation of something previously provided, and the thing provided doesn't have regulatory approval. And we can talk about the different pathways if that's of interest to you. It's typically provided through a clinical trial, through what we would call an extension, or a local legal pathway that allows investigational medicines to be administered to trial participants or individuals outside the context of a trial. Post-trial access is another term you might hear. It's a shorthand, often used to refer to the actual legal pathway, like a post-trial access pathway, sometimes used to describe how you do that. So what I'm talking today is that very specific bucket of when somebody finishes a clinical trial, they now have been benefiting and that's not yet approved by the health authority. I think intent is an important place to pause as well as we really think about why this is an important thing to consider. The goal of continued access is to make sure that participants in clinical trials who've benefited can actually access it. So imagine the scenario that you finish a phase 2 proof of concept, have some very encouraging data, still need to do a pivotal phase 3. Those trial participants, you may have a sufficient guess around the benefit risk that those individuals will need to continue on that medicine for quite a while. Phase 2 is a little questionable, and we can talk about how much evidence is required to think about continued access. But definitely in a pivotal phase 3, you can imagine it still takes time to get health authority approval, and you have people who have benefited from medicines, and if they are not able to access them just by their doctor prescribing, the burden on that manufacturer is going to be quite significant to figure out how to make that work. In general, this is thought of as serving as a bridge to commercial access or more durable, credible, long-term access. Well, we can talk a little bit about the scenarios in which it doesn't always turn out that way and when things come up, but it's not intended to solve for a long-term problem. It's also not, as I said, eventually you want to transition these participants into the healthcare system. And I'm going to look at Q&A as we go in case I can answer anything in the moment. Oh, that's a great question. So we'll get into that. The question in the Q&A about, are we talking about people who received the investigational product, but what about those who received a placebo or active control? So in general, when I'm talking about continued access to an investigational medicine, I'm talking about the thing that is not yet approved on the market. I'll come back to your question related to placebos and active controls, and if I don't get to it, remind me in the Q&A and we'll come back. But in general, you can think of a heightened responsibility for the sponsor to be providing that thing that they have control over that that person can't get anywhere else. There is some guidance, some sources of guidance. This is not an exhaustive list, but I give you 3 examples of references that people like to refer to when they're talking about continued access. The Declaration of Helsinki in paragraph 34 talks about making provisions for post-trial access. And importantly, and this kind of ties into the question that was just asked, it's expected that the sponsors, the researchers, the host country governments. So all of those stakeholders, and there's a continuum in the responsibility, but they're the ones who are obligated to think about how these products are going to be made available to participants who still need it once it's been identified as beneficial. And this goes to the point the person in the Q&A made, who still need an intervention identified as beneficial in the trial. That could mean, or could be interpreted as, well, if I was on placebo and you've identified an intervention that's beneficial, why shouldn't I get access as well? And we talk about, does that mean immediate access? Does that just mean the obligation to make it available in that country? So that's an interesting debate we'll get to and maybe can talk about in a couple of slides and later on in the Q&A as well. So again, not real prescriptive, talks about making provisions for, and kind of puts the obligation across a range of entities. The Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences talks about, again, making plans for, and I took out some of the text and tried to pull in what was critical, providing continued access to study interventions that have demonstrated significant benefit. And here, COMS talks about continued access. So again, I think if going back to the question, if you're thinking about what's demonstrated and where that obligation is, it tends to be on the research sponsor if it's investigational. One could argue that if there are other standard of care and other types of therapies that maybe were demonstrated as beneficial and not the investigational agent, that may make it more part of the healthcare system and the sponsor to create a bridge if there are any gaps. And a lot of this is in the transition planning as well. I think another point important here in COMS is about agreeing before the start of a trial, and we'll get to that later, but I think that's an important part to think of. And then the Nuffield Council on Bioethics talked about the question of access could be explored before full regulatory approval. So this is even softer, could be explored. They note that it's especially important when you have a life-threatening or seriously debilitating condition. And I'll ask you to remember that when we get to some of the discussion around criteria for whether this should be all trials, whether it should be some trials, a subset, and how you might make that assessment. I will also say, and it's important to note, that there are some jurisdictions that have legal requirements to actually continue to provide medicines, for example, for Brazil, for a very long time, if not the lifetime of that individual. So when we're talking about continued access, trying to make an assessment, this assumes that we're going to have to follow any laws in the jurisdiction where we do the trials. But the last time I checked, the number of those jurisdictions is not that great. And the majority have no requirements or follow guidelines like this that give a lot of flexibility and interpretation that require an assessment and some kind of policy or some kind of trade-off and assessment. I would be remiss if I did not mention some really important work done at the Harvard Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center on post-trial responsibilities. This was a multi-stakeholder working group that deliberated and created principles and a toolkit. Because as we just saw, a lot of the challenge is trying to interpret those things of what does it mean to make provisions for? What does it mean to benefit? Who gets to decide those things? Do we do it for everything? And what I also loved about the document that MRCT put together, and full disclosure, I was part of that working group, so I guess I'm saying I love the work I did, but it was really important and informed by a lot of different people. Their responsibilities exist across a spectrum. Whether it's the research sponsor, whether it's the manufacturer, whether it's the healthcare system, but it talked about the handoff and how responsibilities can shift and obligations depending on what point you are in that clinical trial. Laid out principles and approaches, incredibly useful toolkit for starting to think about and develop an institutional policy. And it was issued back in 2018. And as we, and many of us in industry, started to roll it out and use it, we've found that operationalization of it actually requires maybe some further elaboration by the institution to make some of these judgment calls and apply ethics in a particular way. So we've done some follow-up work that we'll hopefully be talking about sometime soon. But this has been a really important summary of good practices, good thinking, and how to even start thinking about this difficult challenge. I wanted to try to include in the discussion a bit of an approach from a stakeholder perspective, and you'll see this in the pre-approval access. So I've given you what appears to be a laundry list, but I want to just talk through them a little bit to try to place then the ethical considerations in context. Most immediately, you have that individual patient, that trial participant, that for whom access is going to be critical. And yet in clinical trials, that research sponsor does not have a direct relationship with that trial participant, but for their participation in the clinical trial. There is the investigator that is responsible for the conduct of research and the care and the treatment of participants. So there's a distance between that we require appropriately oversight of the medical assessment and that experience and rely on that investigator. So for those of you listening to this who are clinical researchers, research coordinators, know very well that challenge of being there as both a researcher, but also an advocate, trying to understand what's best for participants. And this can be tricky when making assessments about whether somebody's still benefiting from an investigational agent that hasn't been approved yet, whether they should be transitioned back to standard of care or other types of therapies. And other clinical trial participants that have this sort of similar dynamic of how do we think about the individuals versus that group of participants, different countries, different regions, different laws, different expectations, different standards of care in the actual country in which they live. You also have patients that aren't even in the clinical trial, people who might be waiting for that regulatory approval, people who didn't even know how to get in the clinical trial, patients who didn't qualify for the clinical trial. So we have competing interests there as we're trying to manage this tension between accounting for the individuals in the trial and others outside of it who might not have been able to participate. And we'll talk about this a little bit in the context of, do we have an increased moral obligation to those in the trial versus people who are not, or is that even a productive analysis to go through? The manufacturer and the company developing the product, again, if we think about the point at which they have the maximum amount of accountability, is that space between when that trial ends and when it hits regulatory approval and it's able to be on the shelf prescribed by a doctor. So the only way to get it in that investigational phase is through the manufacturing company. And that's when, and again, we talk about span of control and influence, that's when it's greatest and the manufacturer has that greatest accountability. We also have then the local government, the local regulatory authority, where it's appropriate and applicable, local health technology assessment body who's making the decision of whether the government's going to pay for it. And this is interesting because you have this tension between trying to hand off perhaps to entities that don't necessarily have any connection to that individual, and you're trying to work within the jurisdiction and the requirements, but things can happen along the way that then ultimately prevent it from being accessible. And how do you then think about how that shifts the obligation of the manufacturer, and does it shift? So for this group interested in research, these will look very familiar and will not be surprising, but I tried to place them in a bit of an order. As those of you who practice ethics know, it's you can't necessarily, and we don't typically in research ethics give hierarchy to the principles, and there's a lot of really interesting literature on that. In the case of continued access to investigational medicines, usually the argument for continuing access that rises to the top is non-maleficence and a duty to not harm. We recently had a very interesting debate about justice's reciprocity, because that's often another principle that's advocated for at the outset of saying people participated in research, we have a duty to them to allow them to have continued access. But there's some really interesting literature also that talks about, especially in the context of health equity and access to clinical trials, how strong is that argument? Are you giving priority to people who happen to be privileged enough to participate in research and were able to get into clinical trials? Are you leaving behind populations, or are you unnecessarily burdening those who didn't get into the clinical trial by putting resources into giving continued access and priority to trial participants? So there's some really interesting literature that really shifted my thinking on placing justice as reciprocity as a priority, and went back to more focusing on what is the actual harm being done to this individual if you take something away from them that they've benefited from. And that is it helps crystallize the analysis as we'll start to think about some of the challenges and considerations. Because if the answer is that they're going to be significantly harmed, they don't have other options, and there is a legitimate harm, it becomes a little bit easier to then figure out how to find those solutions, whereas the reciprocity argument is a little more difficult. Of great tension here also is the distributive justice versus individual justice. And here, the costs of continuing long-term extensions, of providing drug supply for long periods of time, they necessarily have opportunity costs to them. So if you pay for this, there will be something that can't be funded. So resources are finite. So this one is is an interesting one where I think there's a lot of obligation on the part of the research sponsor to think through the stewardship of resources. Again, I think the harm question probably trumps the cost, and that's at least the analysis I argue. But trying to balance those individual considerations is definitely a challenge as we think about what is the appropriate way to spend resources. This is coming up a lot because long-term extensions that happen after clinical trials can be very expensive and very long. And if that's the only way to provide continued access, how do we think about that? How can we be smarter about how we deploy some of those extension trials? Transparency, and this ties into the respect for the individual and some limitations on those rights. One of the most critical things, I think, is how do you appropriately place in context for a potential clinical trial participant what's going to happen to them, or what's going to happen with continued access at the end of research when you don't know what's going to happen. By the very nature of research, you are doing something that you don't know the answer to. And trying to explain to people in a reasonable way that isn't too general, will you get the drug? Will you not get the drug? How will we make that decision? Who makes that decision? What happens in these scenarios has proven to be very challenging, especially in the era of 45-page informed consents and patients who are more concerned about getting into the research or conducting the clinical trial and getting into that than what is necessarily going to happen at the end. So this continues to be a challenge to create appropriate expectations so that people do understand and either aren't disappointed, so that investigators aren't disappointed, and so that everyone is very clear so that they know what the trade-off is at the outset. I listed beneficence last, not because it's not important, but I think the point here is that research itself is not guaranteed to confer benefits to individuals. One could argue that by participating in research, there have been some benefits, but yet somebody not able to participate maybe didn't have that benefit as well. So I think in general, when we've been debating this, beneficence does not necessarily rise as high on the priority list of resolving some of the challenges we've come up with. So it tends to fall more into those buckets that I highlighted at the beginning of that contemplation of harm. What is the duty owed to those individuals who participated in research? And how do we think about balancing those tensions of meeting those individual obligations versus the greater good and trying to get the trials done to create broad access? I'm going to do a quick check at Q&A. Yeah, so thank you, Mariana. I think that is one of the arguments about the control or standard of care arm. And if an individual is in there and they could still receive the standard of care, that argument, you're right, is not as strong for that population. Placebo's a little tricky because it was part of the risk of entering research. But definitely with a standard of care active arm, I think that is a little different. But then you've got sort of the justice as reciprocity. And I'll flip to the challenges while I talk about something in that regard. One thing, we're talking about the ethical considerations right now, but there are some legal considerations that go along with the ability to provide access. And one of the things that we've run into, I say we as an industry and thinking about this and getting feedback, is you can imagine that if our policy was every single patient, every single time got flipped over to a long-term extension, got put in our drug forever until we made it commercially available, that starts to look possibly like inappropriate behavior, like we're just trying to get as many patients as we can onto drug before it hits market. And the Office of the Inspector General could see that as trying to seed the market. So generally thinking about what are the appropriate criteria to balance the finite resources? What are the appropriate cases to make for converting people over to the investigational agent? How do you do that in a way that is appropriately scientifically rigorous? How do you do that in a way that does not confound your results by converting your active or your standard of care, your placebo, over to the investigation? So I think That's why that it's not as simple as just saying we should have everybody in standard of care and placebo flipped over if it works. There are both scientific methodology, ethics and integrity of conducting research and appropriate commercial activities that could be considered. So it's a little bit more complicated. So thank you, Mariana. That's exactly, at least in my mind, how the non-maleficence argument is a little helpful, especially for active and standard of care. Let me just click and see. I got one more. Before we go into, yeah, so thank you about I'll talk more about the risk of jeopardizing ultimate authorization more in pre-approval access, but it could come up in continued access, as I just mentioned. How do you think about managing your obligations to follow safety for a long time? How do you think about the structure of your evidence generation plan while still managing those needs to be able to continue access? Not as much of an issue, or it doesn't come up quite as much in continued access as it does. I think the argument is often brought up more in the context of pre-approval access. So some of the challenges I thought that might be interesting to bring up, and I've started to address some of them along the way, but again, with finite resources, generally we're thinking about it's not necessarily all clinical trials. It could be the vast majority of them, but what might criteria exist to say, is this appropriate to transition patients to, to transition them to other options or no options at all? The popular one that I hear often, it's not my idea, but I'll use it, is if you're doing a study for the reduction of hair loss. Now, one could argue that that could really be impactful. As somebody who appreciates having a nice full head of hair and I started losing it, that could be very emotionally difficult. But they usually try to say, okay, is that going to then cause significant harm or mortality? Do we have other options for it? What might be available? The other discussion around this is often around anti-hyperglycemic agents. We're fortunate to have a large selection of different therapies that might help patients. So if you're doing a new trial with one trying to get at a different aspect of it, one might be able to say, what could we do? Is it necessary to continue, and would they be better off on an existing standard of care until we get to the end? So those are some of the ones that we use to say, okay, are we talking about life-threatening? Are we talking about harm from transition? Is it just against medical practice to even thinking about, like, if you get somebody stable on something, even if it's not death that's going to happen, are they going to go through irreversible disease progression before you can get them on something? Is it going to send them down a path of not having their disease controlled? So in general, most sponsors, I can do some hand waving here as we think about it, or big pharma, are thinking about this in a criteria-based way to try to really prioritize and make sure those patients who don't have options or significantly harmed are going to be the ones that get put into these continued access programs. But again, that's the sponsor making that population level assessment. And what we might also run into is the individual responder who uniquely responds. And let's say this goes to the next one. Let's say we don't have a trial that demonstrates favorable benefit risk, but we have some individual responders. How do we think about that? How does that factor into an investigator's and a healthcare provider's duty to advocate for their patient and observe benefit and try to figure out if they should be allowed to continue? I will say, generally, if there is a safety issue, so let's say you have a trial that does not have favorable benefit risk and there are clear safety issues, that's an easier one to bucket and say, we shouldn't be allowing people to continue on something that we've demonstrated is unsafe. The more difficult ones that come up that often evolve into case-by-case assessments or independent assessment is, what if it's just a question about efficacy? Maybe it doesn't work quite as well, but this subgroup of patients responded, or this individual patient responded. Then again, it's also looking at, what are their other treatment options? What do we know about removing it? What would happen to them if they do regress? But that's one of the most difficult ones, is when there's lack of certainty from an efficacy perspective at the population level and you have individual responders. And I've seen both circumstances where we've had life-threatening conditions where we continue providing access, until they progress. And I've seen other circumstances where the physicians transition them to standard of care and make the choice to move on. And that's hard though, because transitioning to reasonable alternatives. So let's say you include in your informed consent that if there are reasonable alternatives available, take the anti-hyperglycemic agent example, we're going to transition those to those, or that's what the post-trial provisions are going to be. Again, you could make some arguments around risk of harm. It depends on, I guess, how much did they benefit? Did it take care of a side effect in those other reasonable alternatives that wasn't addressed? Do they have the risk, especially in immunological diseases or neurological diseases, if you remove that therapy and they do have irreversible progression, you've now made them worse off in their disease. So the reasonable alternative ones is really difficult and limited in the sense that it really needs to be an honest assessment, I think. And this is where good medical practice, good assessment of what would a doctor do in general. Would you take somebody off of this? Would this make sense? And who gets to decide? The individual investigator is obviously the one making the assessment at the patient level, but the sponsor and the research sponsor and the manufacturer has the holistic data set and the more population-based, but those don't always, as we know, align, and that can result in some difficult challenges to make assessments. Just doing my quick time check. Of particular challenge is affordability. And this question has come up of what about participants who can't afford the medicine once commercially available? I will just tell you right now that I don't think we have a great answer to this yet. We've batted it around though, like, does the sponsor have the increased moral obligation to participants versus non-participants in the sense of affordability? And this kind of goes back to that literature on justice as reciprocity. And you'd like to say, well, the affordability is connected to the person's personal situation, to what their government is willing to pay for. But that's a very unsatisfying argument when you as the research sponsor have been providing access and then knowing that it might not be provided. So we can dive more into that in the Q&A, but that continues to be a really difficult space to be in when we have those circumstances. And treating like versus like, this has come up a lot in global trials. So let's say laws vary, but then also more importantly, imagine trials being conducted all over the world. You have very different, often, or you can be, different standards of care in different parts of the world. And I think I saw a question on resource limited settings. So it could look very different of what the reasonable alternatives might be in a particular country versus a different country. And so there is that assessment as well as we think about not just being not just equality, but equity. Like if somebody is in a different position, how do we think about how that impacts them so we don't just make a unilateral decision that negatively impacts some individuals who are not in the same place? And it's that great image of the difference between equality and equity, and about how do you account for the unique circumstances of those individuals. And that is also a challenge and an operational complexity of then implementing that type of program. So let me just check real quick at the Q&A to make sure I haven't missed anything. Still a trial drug until it gets all approvals. Might be safe during the study, but during the study there's strict follow-up. Right, so that's another point, and thank you for raising that. Data collection is going to be very different in the post-trial space, especially if you're not in a long-term extension and you're now in just a local legal pathway that's more like an expanded access, like we're going to talk about in just a minute, where you have long-term extensions. Part of the reason why they're so expensive is because they do have usually monitoring, blood draws, routine visits, follow-up, and they're very different than just utilizing a local legal pathway. So it's why we go back to the beginning to say, what is your evidence generation plan? What are you going to need to generate after the trial? Are you going to need long-term safety? What are the minimum endpoints you're going to need? Do you need long-term durability of efficacy? So thinking about that in advance will then help you understand about do you need data collection? Can you transition to other types of mechanisms of providing access? So it is an important consideration, though, from my perspective, at the front end, to think about what is required from an evidence generation perspective. So for pre-approval access, I will note this is a topic that there are many really bright, talented, intelligent people talking about from the ethics space. There's some really great work out of NYU, out of Coupa, if you've not heard of that organization, and a lot of really important discussions that have been had over the years, especially the last decade, about pre-approval access. So what I want to do is not rehash what everybody else has talked about in the literature and in public, but maybe hit some highlights of some of my perspective, again, trying to layer in that stakeholder and ethical consideration and operationalization perspective. Sorry, my computer's not cooperating. So again, starting with, again, just a really high level terminology level setting. The legal pathway in the US is called expanded access. Most of you are probably familiar. It provides a legal mechanism for providing access to an investigational drug prior to approval. I prefer the term pre-approval access. I think compassionate use is another one that is used, but it has a little bit of a connotation that if you don't grant access, you're not being compassionate. And as someone who is often on the front lines of helping teams make difficult decisions, supporting our team that is responsible for our policy, it can be very challenging to feel like you're being told that you're not compassionate because you're saying no, even if there are really important reasons why you're saying no. So I appreciate those who use this, but I tend to stay with pre-approval access, which is a more factual definition of what you are doing. You're giving access prior to approval. I am not an attorney, so what I say on right to try is my perspective as a bioethicist in general, and I think this is consistent with what other ethicists have said. It didn't really do much to help. People already had the right to ask, they already had the right. Some people say it should be called the right to ask. They already had the right to ask. It basically just effectively removes the FDA from the process, which is actually a really important body for oversight. It doesn't guarantee you get access. The companies can still say no. It's not necessarily the best, it's not necessarily the best thing to do to remove some of the restrictions around informed consent and other protections. So it's an interesting, I think the best thing Right to Try did was give visibility to pre-approval access and educating people about it and asking questions. That, I think, was a positive that came out of it, that more people knew about this pre-approval access pathway. So in that case, I do think it was positive. But I think there are some other downsides that are already well covered by other ethicists and folks in the literature and media. But I did want to at least mention that. And the important feature, probably the big punchline, is it basically takes the FDA out of the process. And I like to throw this in there because access to investigational medicines is not new. It's been around. FDA's had it in place since the 1930s. If you can imagine, back in the 1960s, they granted it through a variety of different mechanisms, primarily by telephone. I can't even imagine. AIDS epidemic is really what brought scrutiny to the process, to extended timelines, to the complexities in paperwork, and really resulted in some important procedural changes so that now the timelines are much better. The materials go through more quickly. But then the social media and the GoFundMe era, I think, has really placed increasing pressure, as we've seen with some very hallmark examples over the last decade or so, that have continued to thrust questions about what is this, what should be expected, and what is owed to people in that context. And again, I think it's important to remember the intent is this is for people who aren't eligible for clinical trials. So obviously the first, or maybe not obviously, but the first thing we want to do is get as many people as possible into clinical trials to be able to generate the evidence, to be able to create broad access. But it's for people who aren't eligible, have no other options, have life-threatening conditions. And similar to post-trial access, this is supposed to be a bridge to commercial access, to durable, credible, legal access. not necessarily intended to be used for long-term access, although there are some circumstances where it can be. That wasn't the intent. It was with the understanding that in that period, while product's still being developed and doctors can't prescribe it, the manufacturers have the most control, and can they create a legal pathway to allow access in these circumstances? And I think that's, again, an important part of the intent of manufacturing that we should have, that it is with this idea toward commercial access. The stakeholders in this one, not surprisingly, really focusing, as you think about the individual patient, the family of the patient, and these very compelling stories of often of people who have no options, who are searching for options, and the very personal, emotional pleas for help. And this makes this a particularly challenging situation to have a more, I don't want to say dispassionate, meaning you don't have feelings for it, but to try to really think about the bigger picture, to try to think about not just the individual patient. What about all the people participating in the clinical trial? What about the commitment made to them to have a trial with integrity, to get to regulatory approval? Other patients with the same condition. It's so difficult to have a very compelling individual in front of you and ask somebody to think about the bigger picture and all the other people and equity, when that one person is very real and very in front of you and very compelling, and you don't have the stories of everybody else. So that's what I think makes this one of the most difficult aspects of pre-approval access. The treating physician is advocating, rightfully so, for their patient, and should be advocating and trying to find all the different avenues for treatment, for options and things for their patient. So they have an appropriate advocacy role. We'll talk in a second about how that can sometimes blur over into broader advocacy, like in social media campaigns, beyond the physician. But also the treating physician likely doesn't have all the data, enough data. Maybe they have some data, maybe they have some experience, but they're operating also from a limited perspective. The manufacturer and the company developing the product is the one accountable to try to get the product to market, but then also develop the data, has the majority of the data, if not all of it, understanding how their product is being used, and yet has this very real tension of trying to be responsive to individual needs while still trying to advance to broad access for others. As we mentioned, the local regulatory authority has an important role in oversight of the mechanisms, making sure that there are still appropriate notifications and understanding, making sure that what is being done is not inherently unsafe. So there is a role for that still, that safety monitoring, even though you could hear somebody saying, well, why can't I just do it? If I'm willing to take the risk, why should I not be allowed to do this? And we have lots of examples of limitations on individual rights where we don't permit everyone to do everything they want for very good reason, but it still can be a very difficult discussion and a tension-filled discussion. As we think about ethical considerations here, I do think the benefit in here, maximizing benefit, especially for this type of population, for individuals and groups, is where I see the ethical consideration tipping the most, trying to at least bring benefit to people who have no options, who may be able to benefit. I can't remember if I have on the next slide of this slide, but the concept of therapeutic misconception and this belief that they're going to be helped. You could argue that could actually be helpful. The placebo effect of whether it works or not, just the knowledge that you're getting something, could be helpful. And yet we have that obligation to maximize the benefit for the broader patient population or others, or even ensuring. And this goes back to one question that was asked about the risk to clinical trials. And maybe it falls into the bucket of minimizing risk of harm. But one argument that could be put forward is, if you have a death in a pre-approval access program, does that then shut down your clinical trials and put you on clinical hold and delay you? And in general, I'll do some hand waving here, and those of you who are more expert than I am can chime in on the chat. That's not necessarily been something that has come to fruition, but it is a legitimate concern, that tension between balancing your obligation to try to keep the integrity of clinical trials and what may or may not happen with a very different, maybe a sicker population in the pre-approval access program, and how might that impact perceptions of the drug and the intended population. So I do think that is an important thing to think about as you're thinking of medical criteria and thinking about your strategies in advance for pre-approval access. The justice's equity question, trying to make it at least as transparent as possible for everyone to be able to know how to ask, be educated. This is where I said, I at least think Right to Try did something good in that regard to try to help educate people on what tools they do have, because I feel like it used to be just if you had really great insurance and a great doctor who was advocating for you and you knew somebody or you had resources, those could be potentially the people who might be more sophisticated to ask. And I still think it's an important thing to think. And social media has really served as, I don't know, you could say, I guess you could say it's, I don't know. I don't feel like it's leveled the playing field. It's made it a challenging play field, because then people who are sophisticated with social media can make very compelling cases, as they've done in historical cases, for individuals that may miss the point and some really important details behind these considerations of the greater good. But equity also comes up in the making decisions and justice's fairness of thinking, how do you create criteria so that you are creating people who are similarly situated in a similar way and not providing preferential treatment just because you do know somebody, just because you might be related to a KOL. So the questions of justice and equity and transparency are really bound up, in my opinion, and some of the trickiest ones, again, where you have these very compelling individuals who might surface their case, and there might be pressure to respond to that. And yet you're saying, what about all the other patients that didn't know to ask? What about, are you going to open then the program for others like this patient? Really brings up some interesting challenges that I'll talk about a little bit on the next slide. And finally, again, I flagged here respect for personal autonomy, individual rights, but not unlimited rights. And this one is really difficult, I think, it's that I should be able to accept the risk that I want to accept. And yet I think that ignores or it minimizes the real potential of other harms to drug supply, ability to make it more broadly accessible, potential risks to the clinical trials. And so there is an inherent need to think about the individual implications and how that can affect the greater good. I'm going to flip to the next slide and then take a look at some of the Q&A and chat that's come in. Actually, let me do that right now in case I can cover it. And Rebecca and Melissa, hopefully this will help us have no stress about, I'll save Ozempic for the Q&A. Okay, I'll come back to this. Let me finish up this, and then we've got some really good questions in here. I already talked a little bit about availability of drug supply. This can be a very real rate limiting factor for pre-approval access, especially early in the development of a product. As a former chemist, I can remember scraping milligrams of product out of flasks in a GLP environment, but trying to advance products through development to get enough to do all the testing for those. And we did a lot of preparation of active pharmaceutical ingredients for clinical trials as well. And in those early days, your syntheses aren't great. You may not have good yields. You're trying your best to generate enough product for the clinical trials and clinical evaluation. So it can be a very difficult thing then to account for pre-approval access. And again, some of this goes into planning. Can you plan ahead? Can you think about investing more? Sometimes it's not possible, sometimes it is. I mentioned this, but I want to come back to it and hit on it. That importance of completing clinical trials. And I think, and Zeke Emanuel says it in the 7 things that you need to have ethical research, like scientific integrity and a commitment to finish it and to create generalizable knowledge. You have that obligation to be a good steward of those clinical trials. Creating different types of pre-approval access programs can impact your recruitment. Why would I go be in a clinical trial if I can maybe figure out a way to get it through pre-approval access? Now, in theory, you're not supposed to be eligible for a clinical trial, but somebody may be motivated to maybe shift their story, or maybe it's not possible for them to participate in a clinical trial. And this is coming up a lot with health equity concerns now of trying to figure out how we make it more accessible. So there could be impacts on recruitment from pre-approval access programs. And you do also potentially risk incentivizing people dropping out of clinical trials. Why would I stay in a placebo arm of a trial if I know I can get it in an expanded access program? So there are real risks to creating unintended consequences by opening it. So it is an important consideration as you think about your clinical trial strategy and how to set medical criteria and different types of criteria. So truly those who can't participate in research are able to access it if possible. We already talked about the very compelling individual stories, the pressures of social media, or individuals with power and influence. I did see Ken Mock at one point on the participant list, and he could tell this story better than anyone with the Josh Hardy case. But this continues to be a real challenge, especially just because of human nature and just because of, again, the power of having a face behind a compelling story. And how do you balance that? And how do you continue to be a champion for not just an individual, but all of the individuals and all the patients? I think that's the criticality of leveraging things like independent reviews, proactive strategies, ethical consultations, and things like that to make sure we have that rigor behind how decisions are made so that we do have the confidence to say, this has been very thoughtful. We've transparently articulated our criteria. And in these cases, we must say no. And those are some of the hardest conversations I think we have in industry. We talked a bit about transparency, the lack of data collection. So similar to post-trial access, again, data collection and expanded access programs, and this is a point of debate as well of could it be better, but in general, it's not going to be your most systematic way to collect data. So you have to really think carefully about whether you open up a broad expanded access program and allow a lot of access when maybe you should try to do a clinical trial. Do you see a large population asking for a lot of access? Is that an indicator that there might be an interest? And you could create a clinical trial. That is an important question, I think, that needs to be asked. We talked about therapeutic misconception. Another one, how much evidence is enough to justify? And this, again, I think is a challenging question for both post-trial access and pre-approval access, and the importance of setting a strategy in advance and thinking about what evidence you expect to generate along the way. What indications are you studying? How will you think about other potential pathways that people might want to explore? So thinking about that in advance and having a plan means that you're not reacting and being reactive when somebody says, hey, I want to look at this particular, I've got a patient and I want pre-approval access. So really driving from criteria, having plans in place beforehand are so critical. So I think with that, I have one last sort of closing thought slide. And I've alluded to these things as I've gone along, but maybe just to highlight, and I think they're relevant possibly for both continued access to investigational medicines and pre-approval access. In general, transparency of the process is perhaps one of the most important things to creating trust and understanding. People may not always like the answer that they're going to get, but if you have a transparent process, you're clear with the criteria, you tell people up front what it's going to look like and what to expect. It may not always work out, and they might not be happy, and it might not be a yes, but that duty to be as transparent as possible so people at least know what to expect, I think is perhaps one of the important lessons, certainly that we've learned and been able to learn about how do you create equity, understanding, and at least trust in the system and the process. Time and time again, criteria-based decision-making, absolutely essential to being able to, again, how do you adequately set expectations for who's in, who's out, who will get access, who won't. And again, driving toward medical consistency and relying on that expertise will again help the transparency and again help set expectations. I've hammered this one. I'm an old project manager, so this one always is important for me of thinking about things in advance, proactively identifying those strategies and really being able to articulate in advance so that you can plan for costs, drug supply and different things. Lynn, I see your hand. Thank you. And then consistency in decision-making. We've talked a lot about how do you create systems and things to have no preferential treatment? How do you avoid having someone come in and say, I'm the boss's daughter and I would really love to have access? Or even having KOLs come in and say, I'm not going to do clinical trials unless you promise to give me drug. How do you create and can you create in a culture of policies and organizational ethics to say, this is how we're going to do this. This is how we're going to approach it. And we're going to hold hands, do it together and be consistent in how we think about it. And I think, and this is where I will mention my company, J&J has been a big believer in independent review when appropriate in a range of different circumstances, most notably clinical trial data sharing, but then also pre-approval access with colleagues at the NYU School of Medicine. So with that, I see Rebecca's picture coming up, so I better save at least 15 minutes for Q&A. I tried to hit some along the way, but with that, I'll stop sharing, Rebecca, and we can go to what are a lot of questions I see.
Well, thanks so much, Carla, for a very clear presentation on both of these topics and looking at a practical approach, but also giving some of the ethical perspectives along the way and also answering a number of these questions as you've gone along. I just had a few, overarching general questions for you. And then we'll certainly hit some of the remaining questions as we have time. I see a number of these names and I see that there are some healthcare providers as well. So I had a question in terms of some of the practical realities of implementation. So some people might be here thinking, what if I'm sitting here with a patient in front of me and I have to implement either post-trial access, a patient is coming off a trial and I'm concerned about this, or pre-approval access. What are my next practical steps here? And could you help point the way?
So if I understand your question, you're an investigator, so I guess ideally, it would be prior to the trial even starting. And if your drug sponsor, the sponsor who's providing the drug for the trial has not included it in your informed consent, in your clinical trial agreement, in your protocol, the first question is to ask, what are we doing at the end of the trial? What's going to happen? So that would be, I would say, one thing to say, especially when you're doing research with an industry sponsor, if it's not clearly laid out in the documents you see, absolutely. Is it going, and it could be the answer is we're not going to provide, but that should be clear. And if we are going to provide, for how long? How will you make the decision when it stops? And is that clearly laid out? It should be. So I think that's the first thing in terms of advocating. But let's say you find yourself midstream in a clinical trial. Let's say it is maybe vague or uncertain. I guess if it's with an industry sponsor, again, I think seeking clarification what those transition plans are, how will those decisions be made? And I think as a medical practitioner, you still are obligated to think about what is the best for your patient that you know of so far. And this is where it gets really tricky. And I think because you could even have a patient that is finished their portion of the trial's continuing, everybody's still blinded, and you're going to be in a place where they're still going to be receiving either that therapy or not. So it's almost more of a trying to obviate that upfront, trying to have an open dialogue with both the sponsor providing the drug and your patient about the limitations and options that are going to be best for that patient, and really being honest with yourself about what does benefit look like. I don't know if I've gotten to your question, but that's almost a problem of after the fact that needs to be addressed at the beginning.
Well, that's very helpful. And then another question is, what about the challenges in terms of, investigator-initiated studies? What are the obligations? What should people be thinking about? There might be some on the line that are actually running these or thinking about planning for these.
Thank you. It's such a tough one, right? Because in those cases, an investigator has come to a sponsor and said, and I'll use this example, come to a sponsor and said, I'd like to have some drug. Can you please provide it? I want to do this study. There's a review process. But if the investigator doesn't think in advance about what they're going to do at the end, and let's say it is a product, let's take the easier situation of the products already on the market. So they have an idea, they want to run something. If it's already on the market, it's a little bit easier, maybe because they could, in their own professional judgment, prescribe it off label. But then that's going to have cost implications. And is that really a durable pathway for those patients? In the circumstances, they're more seldom, but when the product is invested, this comes up more in oncology. If an investigator wants to do something with an investigational product that's not approved for anything, that definitely is a red flag to ask, what are we going to do with these patients at the end? Oftentimes the terms will be that drug will be provided until the patients progress. Because we are often dealing with a very sick population. But we had an example, and I won't name any of the drugs or players, but where a drug worked very well for a patient population that typically had a prognosis of 1 to 2 years. And we have patients who are still on the drug for 10 years, doing very well. It's a wonderful success story, but that was not what was planned. So I think with IISs in particular, what we're building in is prompts to have sponsors ask the investigator questions. What are your plans? How do you plan to discuss, what are you telling your patients? Or do you have a plan for this? Because we also have the challenge of needing to be at an arm's length. The whole point of investigator initiated is that we're not interfering and mucking around in investigators' research. So we're prompting. So I would suggest to investigators doing research that you think about that and proactively ask and say, let's discuss and negotiate what is going to be that plan, because there could be legal and operational hurdles that make some things just not possible.
That makes sense. Thanks so much.
And while you go ahead.
And then it looks like there's a really interesting question on really the tension of providing drugs, access to drugs, for example, Ozempic, that could be regularly prescribed for something else, for example, to patients with diabetes, and then that could be taking away the supply for other patients, for example, diabetics, when the access to drugs for Ozempic for weight loss. Are there approaches that we can try to mitigate this if we're doing that?
Yeah, I saw that question. It's such a great one. So my personal thoughts on that are that, and I hope I don't offend any of the physicians here, and I don't know what type of more stringent controls we can have for appropriate prescribing. And actually, let me pull that question up to make sure I'm not going too far off. Right. So, yeah, and yet, prescribed off label for some people who've been very fortunate and had a lot of really important progress, and it's been good for them. But yet we know of some of the off-label prescribing that is not necessarily appropriate. Somebody wants to lose 10 pounds for a wedding. Okay, maybe I just call that inappropriate, but maybe somebody else would find that appropriate. The unfortunate thing is that the pharma companies don't necessarily have a lot of control because, right, it's the physician's prescribing. I think there will be some interesting discussions around, will they start, and I don't even want to suggest this, but is there some kind of accountability? Like, we know where our supply goes, and you would hate to see sort of unintended consequences of allowing access to some things. But again, the sponsor really doesn't, the drug manufacturer is removed from that step of prescribing. I think what will be interesting is if there are shared accountability or behaviors in that gray space to say, what should appropriate advertising look like? What should appropriate controls on prescribing look like? What should appropriate controls on access look like? That might need to be different than for a traditional product. And again, that's me just sort of brainstorming, but I feel like this is another one of those circumstances where you have some shared responsibility in the ecosystem to figure out how to make sure the drugs are getting to the patients who need it, not preventing appropriate off-label prescription if a physician feels strongly that the patient would benefit. But yet, how do we have an honest conversation about maybe some of the less compelling reasons that things are being done, and how do we put controls on that? I'm sorry if that's a lot of general speak, but
certainly
it's
makes sense. And here's another interesting question about a recommendation to handle an inquiry for post-trial access for an already approved indication that's investigated for a new indication in clinical trials. For example, an approved if the FDA approves for condition A, but under investigation for a completely different condition B.
That's another one. Thank you for bringing that up. That's another one of the difficult situations. And we almost call it, I think we'd started calling it post-approval access because again, it's complicated by the off-label prescribing. This one is
Yeah.
going to be more limited. It's not considered an investigational medicine. Some jurisdictions do consider subsequent indications investigational, but not all. So first of all, you have a lot of heterogeneity in the jurisdictions on whether something's investigational or not. So in general, we try to go back to the principles of saying, do you have a life-threatening condition where if you transition these patients off, they're going to be significantly harmed? You can't presume, and you don't want to incentivize off-label prescribing. So in those cases, you may have to plan, and usually advice is you have to plan for an extension trial to be able to continue to collect data, provide access. But there is a bit more scrutiny, I think, on those, and we have to be more careful about that. And it gets very confusing again when some jurisdictions allow it and some don't. So then you're going to almost always be defaulting back to a clinical trial in those cases. And we see this in oncology. Again, a lot where you have a lot of successive indications, you might have longer trials to be able to account for that.
Absolutely. I mean, I certainly think that that is the case. So we probably have time for one more question. I mean, I know there's a lot in here and I don't know which one.
So sorry we didn't get to all of them.
Yes. If there's one that you want to answer, we just have so
Let me look
many.
at the chat. What was the chat one? Oh, that was just okay.
Mhm.
Lisa Kearns and Koopa. Equity, hang on. Let me this one isn't actually directly related, but I think it's an interesting question. It speaks to why I think these two topics. So in the setting of things like a global pandemic, how can we explain to people with limited or no scientific medical background why the FDA thinks certain medicines like monoclonal are safe enough to use in an emergency? And I would even, if you'll permit me to expand your question to say, why is it okay to, in some cases, use investigational medicines? Because it's a little bit of an analogous situation where we're saying, not yet legally approved,
Mhm.
but there are extenuating circumstances that allow us to make this judgment call. And it can feel very arbitrary, even sometimes to a scientifically educated population. So I think the question's relevant for both. And the answer is probably going to be unsatisfying, but I think that I'm not quite sure. We've been talking about this a lot of how do we in science, how do we in ethics, where are we falling down on our obligations to educate more generally, to try to instill some of the common things around, like teaching people about the scientific method, teaching people about evidence generation. How do you reach people at a level that they will understand, that will be interesting to them? So I confess that I wanted to answer it because I think a lot of the really smart people who are listening to this right now are probably on the front lines and well positioned to start having those conversations. And if you've got any suggestions, let me know, or if you've seen anything that works well. But I think it's going to be a lot of labor and thoughtful education, engaging with people and showing up where they are to try to help overcome that. Because otherwise, I think things like post-trial access, pre-approval access, that just sounds like gobbledygook. And how do I just get access to a drug?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for that answer. Melissa, would you like to come on and close us out? But I just want to thank you for covering both of these topics, both of which are very weighty and difficult to encapsulate in one talk. And you've done that so effectively and elegantly.
I'm sorry I ran over a bit, Melissa.
No, it's fine.
No, not at all. That was wonderful. And I know a lot of us are always, in many of these talks left with more questions,
Yes,
answers, and that's just how this works. And I hope that people will be able to talk to each other and continue to follow up to get more information on all the amazing questions that you raised in this area so clearly. So thank you so much, Carla.
And what I'll offer, I'll put my email in the chat. So if you didn't get a question answered and you want to reach out to me, please feel free to drop it to me. This was such a pleasure. I really appreciate it.
And thank you to everyone for joining us today. It's great to see so many of you.
absolutely. It was a pleasure having you, Carla. Thank you.
Thank you again. My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.